In a razor-thin vote, the U.S. House passed a landmark amendment removing suppressors, commonly called silencers, from the National Firearms Act of 1934. This move eliminates the $200 tax stamp and lengthy bureaucratic process, a hurdle in place for nearly a century, and folds key language from the long-sought Hearing Protection Act into a must-pass budget bill. Gun rights groups hail this as a major victory, arguing suppressors are safety tools, not criminal accessories, and see this as a first step in rolling back outdated federal overreach. Suppressors, often mischaracterized as silencers, don't make guns silent. They reduce the noise to safer levels, much like a car muffler. Their main purpose is hearing protection for shooters and bystanders, not stealth. Short-barreled rifles, or SBRs, are also tightly regulated under the NFA due to their compact size, a legacy of 1930s crime fears. Recent ATF rule changes reclassified millions of pistols with stabilizing braces as SBRs, sparking controversy and calls for reform. Gun rights advocates argue these regulations are outdated and arbitrary, making SBRs the next likely target for deregulation. The debate over deregulating suppressors and short-barreled rifles, or SBRs, is deeply polarized. Supporters argue that removing strict regulations is fundamentally about safety, protecting shooters' hearing from permanent damage, reducing noise pollution in both urban and rural areas, and making shooting sports more accessible to newcomers. They also claim that suppressors can help prevent hearing loss not just for shooters, but for bystanders and even for hunting dogs in the field. Advocates point out that in many European countries, suppressors are not only legal, but encouraged for responsible gun ownership, and these nations have not seen a spike in gun crime as a result. They argue that aligning U.S. law with these countries would modernize regulations and remove unnecessary barriers for law-abiding citizens. In states where suppressors are already legal for hunting, data shows no measurable increase in crime or poaching. Supporters say this demonstrates that fears about suppressors being used for illegal activity are largely unfounded. On the other hand, opponents, including gun control groups and some law enforcement officials, warn that deregulation could make it harder to detect and respond to gunfire. They argue that quieter gunshots could endanger public safety, making it more difficult for police and bystanders to react quickly in active shooter situations or emergencies. These groups believe that the National Firearms Act's background checks and registration requirements are essential safeguards, helping to keep dangerous weapons out of the wrong hands and providing law enforcement with important tracking tools. Critics of deregulation also challenge the hearing safety argument, suggesting it's often used as a smokescreen for making firearms more accessible and potentially more dangerous. Some medical experts, however, acknowledge the risk of hearing loss but believe other solutions, like better ear protection, should be prioritized. For gun rights groups, the NFA is seen as an outdated law that unfairly penalizes responsible gun owners, creating long wait times and expensive fees for items that are legal in much of the world. For opponents, though, these regulations are a necessary check, one of the few tools available to help keep dangerous items out of the wrong hands and maintain public safety in a country with high rates of gun violence. If this bill becomes law, the process of buying a suppressor would fundamentally change. Instead of the current, often frustrating system, purchasing a suppressor would be as straightforward as buying any standard firearm. There would be no more $200 federal tax stamp, no need to wait months for approval, and no complicated paperwork that can feel overwhelming for first-time buyers. Instead, you'd simply go to a licensed firearm dealer, select your suppressor, and complete a standard background check, just like you would for a rifle or handgun. This would make the process much more accessible and less intimidating for everyday gun owners. The entire process, which currently drags on for months, would shrink to just minutes. Instead of waiting anxiously for approval, buyers could walk out with their suppressor the same day, making these devices far more accessible to millions of responsible gun owners across the country. This change would remove a major barrier that has discouraged many from even attempting to purchase a suppressor in the past. However, it's important to remember that federal law isn't the only factor. State laws still apply. And in states like California and New York, suppressors would remain strictly illegal, regardless of any changes at the federal level. Residents in these states would still face significant legal barriers, and attempting to purchase or possess a suppressor, there could result in serious legal consequences. The new law would only streamline access in the 42 states where suppressors are already legal. In these states, gun owners would benefit from a much faster, simpler, and less expensive process. This could lead to more people choosing to use suppressors for hearing protection, hunting, and recreational shooting, as the devices become easier to obtain and less stigmatized. For many gun owners, this is a long-awaited modernization of a burdensome and outdated process. It represents a significant step forward in making suppressors more accessible, while still maintaining important safety checks. The change could also help reduce the stigma around suppressors, showing that they are simply tools for responsible firearm use. Of course, the fight to legalize suppressors in restrictive states would continue at the state level. Activists and advocates would need to keep pushing for change, working with lawmakers and educating the public about the benefits of suppressors. Until then, the patchwork of state laws will continue to shape who can own these devices and where. With suppressor deregulation within reach, gun rights groups are pushing to remove SBRs, short-barreled shotguns, and any other weapons from the NFA through the SHORT Act. The recent ATF brace rule has intensified calls for permanent legislative solutions to prevent future executive overreach. Activists also want to block any federal firearm registry, fearing it could lead to confiscation. By dismantling parts of the NFA, they aim to protect privacy and prevent government tracking of gun owners. The ultimate goal: robust legal protections against any national gun registry. The bill now faces a tough and uncertain road in the Senate, where the rules are complex and the stakes are high. The reconciliation process, a special legislative pathway, could allow the bill to pass with a simple majority, bypassing the usual 60-vote threshold, if and only if the Senate parliamentarian determines that the measure is primarily budgetary in nature. This decision is crucial, as it will dictate whether the bill can move forward under these expedited rules or if it will be subject to a filibuster, which would require broader bipartisan support to overcome. The key question at the heart of this debate is whether removing suppressors from the National Firearms Act is fundamentally a budget item because it eliminates a tax, or if it's a broader policy change that affects gun regulation. This distinction is not just a technicality, it could determine the entire fate of the legislation. If the parliamentarian rules that only the tax component is budgetary, then only that part of the law might be repealed through reconciliation. The rest of the NFA process, like background checks and registration, could remain untouched, leaving much of the current regulatory framework in place. Meanwhile, both supporters and opponents of the bill are ramping up their lobbying efforts, meeting with senators and making their case in the media. The outcome may ultimately hinge on a handful of moderate or swing state senators, whose votes are far from guaranteed, and who face intense pressure from all sides. Even if the bill manages to clear all procedural hurdles, securing the necessary 51 votes is no easy task. Senators are weighing not just the policy implications, but also the political risks and the views of their constituents back home. The final decision will likely come down to a dramatic, high-stakes showdown on the Senate floor, with last-minute negotiations and shifting alliances shaping the outcome until the very last moment. Whatever the result, the vote could have far-reaching consequences, potentially reshaping the future of federal firearms law and setting a precedent for how similar issues are handled in Congress for years to come. Deregulating suppressors would make them more affordable and accessible, improving safety for hunters, sport shooters, and homeowners. Quieter ranges could reduce noise complaints and opposition to shooting sports. For home defense, suppressors could prevent hearing loss in high-stress situations. This bill is part of a broader trend of expanding Second Amendment rights, following recent Supreme Court decisions. Its success or failure will set the tone for future gun legislation. If it passes, expect renewed pushes for SBR deregulation and a federal registry ban. Regardless of the outcome, the debate over gun rights and regulation will remain a central and heated feature of American politics.